believed to be tradition at the time when Judaism, and the world, and that part of the world was going through such an upheaval. We would have ended up like the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Karaites and many others that were unable to continue to flourish in that circumstance. We have, what do they call that in biology? We have a natural experiment, meaning that we couldn't conduct it in a laboratory. You can't sift Jewish people into different groups randomly and then, run them through the same course of history to see what happens. But we do know historically, looking back, that groups of Jews that were unwilling to look at the world as a whole and were only thinking to more rigidly protect what they already believed, generally didn't do as well in the long term. I mean that not just in terms of flourishing numbers or economic benefit, but I mean in terms of the vibrancy of their Jewish life.
Yeah, the interesting thing is they never broke off, though. So, I mean,
no. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, it seems like those who followed Shammai and Eliezer could have broken off and formed a different sect, and they never did.
They could have, and that's one of the fascinating aspects of Judaism is that for much of our history, we have had a very strong resistance to that type of factionalism. It did occur for a while, and unfortunately, it usually occurs when we're in a somewhat stronger position than weaker. I think, which we have now seen again in the last 200 years, where factionalism has become a more of a concern. But for most of our history, Jews were willing to be in the community with people that they disagreed with. And generally speaking, both sides saw the benefit of that. They weren't looking to walk off into the sunset to build their own perfect utopia. They wanted to stay and work things out. It's, like very good couples therapy.
But the Sadduceans, the Sadduceans and the Essenes broke off. So I mean, they could have easily have done the same thing.
Exactly, and that was, again, the way I've seen it is that during the time of the Sadducees, there were certain benefits to them being their own person, if you will. That they had a golden opportunity because of the authority granted to them under the Roman remit. The Essenes likewise had the freedom to pursue their puritanical view of Judaism to their heart's content, because at the time when both were getting going, there was a certain stability in the community, and that allows for factionalism more than when we're under stress. When we're under stress, we tend to turn to one another and say, look, I may not agree with you, but we're in the same lifeboat, and I'm not cutting this boat in half just because I disagree with you. And that, I believe, is one of the reasons why we, by and large, stayed together in between, let's call it roughly 1800 years, where you had Jewish diversity and Jewish cultural changes, but that core idea of we're all in this together, that was never really a huge challenge. I mean, yes, there were cases of people being ostracized, of cherem. There were issues of, calling someone else a heretic or blasphemer and saying that people were wrong and incorrect, but you were calling somebody that was in your group wrong or incorrect. You weren't saying they were outside the group.
Yeah. I noticed it's actually one of the things Slipkin does is like to tell people they're wrong.
Well, yeah, and that's, something actually I talked about in my Torah class this lunchtime today, is that there is a lot of candor in the classical rabbinic writings, that the rabbis were not afraid to say where they disagreed, with whom they disagreed, and why they disagreed. And yeah, they were not shy about that. And I was lamenting that I think that in the modern world, we are maybe a little too shy. I mean, obviously there are extremes out there that could dial it a little bit and stop being quite so abusive to one another. But in general, I think that we should be able to have meaningful conversations directly without worry that we are crossing some line of offense.
Yeah.
It seems like the only people who don't worry about that lines are the ones that are actually offensive.
Didn't you give a speech though? You should always argue like there's a good chance you may be wrong. And I noticed
Of course.
Avadia Yosef tries not to tell people they're wrong too much, or at least comes back a little bit when he does it.
Exactly right. You should always argue with there's a good chance that you're wrong either about part or even the main substance of your point, but that doesn't mean that you don't give your full presentation of the position as you understand it at the moment. So you are ready to admit, you know what, you've made a very good point, or I didn't know that fact, or your interpretation seems more compelling than mine. You should always be ready to say that and be honestly and in good faith analyzing the other person's point of view. But you have to also put your ideas on the table, or else how will the other person know what it is that you're claiming? But we're going to use that as the transition to get in, because otherwise, I love talking about this. We'll be here forever, and then Mishnah will languish. But it is a good segue, because in beginning in chapter 2 and then even more in chapter 3, if we get to chapter 3 tonight, we're going to be looking at topics that polite society considers squeamish, that if this is taboo, one does not talk about these parts of the body in religious discussions. Well, the rabbis did. Well, the rabbis do, meaning that the human body from top to toe is part of God's creation. And there are a number of rules that deal with how we use it and how we interpret its various displays of its human nature, its emissions and other such things. And that's really, the whole crux of Niddah as a Masechet. And we need to be able to talk about them, candidly. It doesn't mean I'll still use a little bit of euphemism here and there, and the rabbis do as well. But we have to do so with recognizing that the human body is a sacred thing. I will also caution that the first section here is not too upsetting, I would imagine, to some, but by the time we get to chapter 3, which deals with the topic of miscarriage, it's something that we have to look at it as though we were reading a clinical medical book. It is not meant to be callous or unfeeling. It is meant to be detailed. It is meant to be precise. And of course, the rabbis commiserate with anyone who goes through the agony of a miscarriage. And this is something that we'll deal with in more detail if we get to chapter 3 today. But I wanted to get that out there just in case people were logging in, to let them know that was coming down the rails, because it can be a little shocking if you're not used to reading this type of discourse from the rabbis. Okay, so picking up in chapter 2, Mishnah number 1, and we are resuming or continuing, I guess, it's been a while in the middle, our discussion of the examination, meaning the examination that's needed around the sexual act to see whether or not the woman has begun to menstruate. As we've talked about extensively in the first chapter, the basic idea is that if menstruation has occurred, then there are certain protocols of purity that kick into place. And obviously, as the Torah delineates, that once menstruation has begun, intercourse shouldn't be happening until it has been completed according to the rules of Torah. So examination is important. In fact, it is so important, we're going to get a rather shocking aphorism here at the beginning. Every hand that makes frequent examination in the case of women is praiseworthy, but in the case of men, it ought to be cut off. So what this means is that using the cloths that were used to check whether or not the uterus had begun to release blood was considered something that could be done frequently, if as a woman, this is talking about the woman examining herself, not someone else examining her, although we'll talk about a special case for that in a minute, that she could check as frequently as she wished. You may remember from chapter 1, in the case where she discovers that she has begun to menstruate, we have to retroactively, up to 24 hours, apply impurity to anything she might have come into contact with. But that retroactive 24-hour window is shortened to also the last time she examined. So if she examined herself an hour ago, and then she suddenly discovers that she's menstruating, then that window would only be an hour wide. So frequent examination will keep that window short. It means that she is constantly aware of her status and all of the halachic implications of that. However, for men, to constantly check whether or not there has been an emission, the parallel case here, is considered to be a terrible thing. Now, obviously, the hand should be cut off is not meant to be taken literally. Judaism doesn't go in for that type of maiming punishment. What is this rhetorical flourish meant? Well, it is meant to indicate that the rabbis were well aware that frequently handling the male organ can sometimes stimulate it to the point that emission will occur. And as they are trying to make sure that no irregular emissions are happening, the idea that you would do something to examine it that would actually cause the problem, or at least potentially exacerbate the problem, does seem very counterproductive. I would like to take just a brief second to talk about the general issue that the rabbis had with the euphemistic phrase of spilling of seed, that the rabbis were very much opposed to the release of the semen in a way that was not within the marital act. Now, why were they so opposed to this? Well, partly it is because in general it was considered to be a neglect of the blessing of the gift of being able to create life. Partly it was because of the Judah and Tamar story, where it was deliberately withdrawn in order not to impregnate her, which is not a great method to avoid impregnation, but that was a characteristic of that story and held much against them because they were failing to fulfill the norm of helping to build up their brother's house. But also we have to understand that there was a scientific reason. That is to say, the rabbis had a scientific understanding, which is incorrect, but it did also influence a lot of their rhetorical flourishing. So the rabbis believed that the seed that came from the man was very much like the seed of a plant, meaning that it contained the entire germination, the entire human that would eventually develop into a baby, that the man was the one who created that, and then it would eventually become implanted within the soil of the woman, to use their metaphor, where it would germinate and grow. And that, yes, while growing, it would draw from the mother in order to build up into the full baby form, but that it was essentially building on or building according to the seed that was self-contained within the man. As such, the intentional or willful spilling of that is the equivalent of willfully spilling a potential life, rather than, as we understand it from modern biology, half of the code that can be used to create life. So the rhetorical flourish was also based upon that understanding of human biology. But yes, in general, the rabbis are not a big fan of self-stimulation in that way for that reason. All right, now I mentioned there was a special category of where a person might not check for herself. In the case of a deaf, a person not of sound senses, a blind or an insane woman, if other women of sound senses are available, they attend to her, and they may eat truma. So In the case of a person who is unable to check themselves because they are lacking the mental capacity to render a proper evaluation, a proper decision, or in the case of a blind woman who cannot see it for herself to be able to estimate it, even if she is of perfectly sound mind, another woman can assist in making sure that she is indeed ritually pure. And thus, she is still able to eat from truma if she happens to be in a Kohen's household. So they are not left out, even if they cannot make that determination themselves, and assistance is fine. Again, I know in the modern world that many people would treat the assistance in this very hands-on way of another woman during the period of menstruation as being beyond the pale. I mean, I know people, men in particular, who won't walk down the aisle of the feminine products in a supermarket because they shouldn't think of such thing. This is a very no-nonsense, realistic world that does not have the same anti-body taboos that we have unfortunately inherited in 21st century culture. We have the strangest mixture of being puritanical and incredibly licentious within this modern society, of wanting to see everything exposed but feeling ashamed at the thought of it at the same time. But that's a whole nother conversation for another time. But don't be surprised that the rabbis are much more cut and dry. Of course, another woman can help this woman to be able to establish her status in order that she'll be able to participate in the eating of truma or not come into contact with truma if she has entered this period. So the rabbis are infinitely more practical and in general have a much better relationship to the body than 21st century American culture. Okay, now we get into one more sort of stringency-ish. It is the custom of the daughters of Israel to have intercourse using two testing rags, one for the man and the other for herself. So the basic idea here would be that in addition, as we'll see, to the pre-check, that there would be a post-check, like we talked about in chapter 1, and that the post-check would be checking her and checking him, meaning that she would examine herself, her own body, with this rag to see if there was any sign of blood. More about that later. And he would check himself with the cloth on his member to see whether there were any signs of blood on himself. In either case, if there is signs, then they would be considered impure, and everything we talked about in chapter 1 and later on would come into effect. Virtuous women prepare also a third rag to prepare the house before intercourse. So virtuous, meaning women that are especially careful of these matters, would also have that additional rag to prepare the house. And as I mentioned, that is a euphemism, meaning that she would examine her organs to make sure that there was no blood prior to that beginning. Any questions? All right. Moving on to Mishnah number 2. If blood is found on his rag, meaning he has now examined himself after intercourse and there is blood on the rag that comes off of his member, they are both unclean and they are liable to bring a sacrifice. So they are both unclean. That is no new news. That is something that was obvious from chapter 1. But this question of bringing a sacrifice we need to discuss. So they're unclean because they have engaged in intercourse while she was beginning her menstrual cycle. Now, because this was an accident, they have to bring a sacrifice. Now, the Talmud goes into more detail for this because there's two types of accidents. There is the accident that could have been rightly assumed as being potentially possible. And then there was the accident out of nowhere. No one expected this kind of thing. We are talking here about the first category of accident, where, as the halacha discusses in more detail in later commentary, where it was close to the beginning of the menstrual cycle, but she hadn't begun yet. They checked and she had not begun. And they thought, well, let's go for it. And, hopefully we'll be done before the cycle will begin. But lo and behold, even though it had not begun before, it had begun by the time they were done. As such, well, they took that risk, knowing that this was a potential. And as such, they have inadvertently, because they didn't knowingly do it while she was in the cycle, but they have put themselves in the position where it was a very a possible thing. As such, they are responsible for bringing a sacrifice for this inadvertent transgression. On the other hand, says the halakha, if this was intercourse at just a normal time during her non-menstrual period, it was not close to it at all, but for some reason there was blood, and it fits all the criteria that we'll talk about later, then yes, they are unclean. The ritual impurity still applies, but there is no sacrifice to be brought, because that would be considered a case of onus, a case of just completely beyond your control kind of things. We can't expect couples to avoid intercourse. They are indeed encouraged to have some joy together in the appropriate times. And as such, sometimes things will just happen because human bodies are human bodies. And sacrifices are not needed in that case, although the other rules of ritual cleanliness still apply. Now, if they knew that she had begun menstruating and they went ahead and had intercourse, then that is intentional, and that is technically a karet level transgression, which is euphemistically translated as death at the hands of heaven. It doesn't mean you should expect lightning bolts, but it does mean that it is a more serious offense. Okay. But that's if it all was done right then. If any blood is found on her rag, that is for his category. If any blood is found on her rag immediately after their intercourse, they are both unclean and must bring a sacrifice. It is the same ruling. However, if blood is found on her rag after a time, achar zman, and we're going to have to define that in Mishnah 3. This after a time, if there is a delay between the intercourse and the check, then they are unclean due to doubt, but they are exempt from a sacrifice. So because there was a slight delay, and we'll see it as a fairly short delay, it means that perhaps the cycle did not begin during the intercourse. Perhaps it began between the end of intercourse and the beginning of her checking. As such, we're not sure. Now, because there is doubt, we will still treat them as though they are ritually unclean from, and him in particular as unclean. Excuse me. Excuse me. Like I said, the body does what the body does sometimes. We will treat them as ritually unclean, and him as well, even though we're not 100% sure that the cycle had begun while they were together. But because we're not 100% sure that the cycle had begun while they were together, we exempt them from a sacrifice. Remembering from earlier discussions that we've had that we don't bring a sacrifice in many cases unless we are sure that the sacrifice is required, which is its own complicated discussion. Yes, Eric.
Rabbi, is there anything about why you don't bring sacrifices in some of these cases because it's a sin offering and not a guilt offering? Because I remember we saw previously that they would bring a sham tului if there was doubt, but I don't remember bringing something similar to that when it was a hatat offering.
Exactly. So this is a sin offering, and as such, we have to be 100% sure that the sin offering is required, or else it would be inappropriate to sacrifice it. And here it is not 100% clear. As we'll see, it could be very likely, but very likely doesn't meet the minimum measure for bringing the sin offering, which that likelihood we're going to see here in Mishnah number 3. Oops. Let's try and get everything on the page. Well, much as I can. Okay, so what is that time? What is meant by after a time? We said that there was very clear that if she checks herself immediately after, that the results apply immediately, that it was definitely during their intercourse. And it said if it was after a time, that there was doubt. Well, how much time is after a time? Well, as long as it takes to get down from the bed and wash her face. So her face is here another euphemism for the generative organs, meaning that she gets out of bed and she goes and she checks, but it is not immediately after intercourse. It is very, very shortly after intercourse. As such, there is that gap of time. And because there is that gap of time, there is that element of doubt of whether or not there was actually menstruation during the time of intercourse. However, if blood was found sometime after, she causes uncleanness retrospectively for a period of 24 hours, but she does not cause the man who had intercourse with her to be unclean. If even later than the washing the face time is when she discovers that she is now menstruating, then yes, we do apply the retroactive 24-hour ritual uncleanness that we talked about in chapter 1, but because it is not close enough to the time of intercourse, we do not apply that ritual impurity to the man that was with her. We cannot say that definitively they were that she was in her menstruation during that time. So there is an odd bifurcation of the application. That on the one hand, yes, the retroactive application of the 24 hours of impurity is taking effect, but because there was this window of time in between the intercourse and the actual checking that discovers the menstruation, we do not automatically apply that to the man that she was with. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, is the 24-hour rule, that's only if she's not having regular periods, right?
We're going to get into the whole regular period thing a lot more detail later in the Mishnah. But generally speaking, yes. But there's a lot more detail to it. But yes, generally speaking, that's fair. And as we said before, it also it's only back 24 hours, back up to the last time that she checked. So if that was less than 24 hours, then that would be, reduce that time window. Now, Rabbi Akiva is a little more blunt. Rabbi Akiva says she also causes the man who had intercourse with her to be unclean. So Rabbi Akiva is like, okay, look, hold on. If you're applying the retroactive 24 hours of ritual impurity to her, then she was with the guy during that time period. And if she was with the guy during that time period, then that means that he was there when it happened. However, we are dealing here with presumptions. And as they are presumptions, the rabbis are willing to make carve-outs within those presumptions because no one knows the actual facts of the case, meaning that we don't have a perfect record of her cycle and when the bleeding first began, that it would then become noticeable. That's not something that is physically possible to track and know. Maybe, I don't know, in another 5 years, someone will develop a product and an app that does that for you. I don't know. But right now, and certainly in the time of the Mishnah, there was no way to know it perfectly. So the rabbis were dealing with probabilities, and they were dealing with establishing reasonable presumptions to allow people to operate. Because if you demand perfect information, then you are going to cripple your ability to actually engage with anything. So Rabbi Akiva says, no, we should retroactively apply to the guy too. He was there when it happened. But the rabbis are saying, look, the retroactive is only a presumption in any case. We don't know that she was actually ritually impure that 24 hours before. We're just going to treat it like that because that's a reasonable assumption. But it's not reasonable to also include him in that assumption when that's going to have a knock-on effect of rendering him ritually impure as well. And so we're going to leave him out of that calculation as we do this. Now, of course, if there is evidence otherwise, then all of this becomes moot. So, for example, if she checked immediately after intercourse and there was no sign, and then she checks an hour later, and there is a sign, then obviously he would not be rendered ritually impure. This is only dealing in cases where there wasn't a continuous check taken immediately after, and it allowed this doubt to creep in. And so the rabbis have to deal with assumptions and probability rather than more information. However, the rabbis do agree with Rabbi Akiva in another way. And the sages agree with Rabbi Akiva that one who saw a blood stain defiles the man who had intercourse with her. So the testing cloth is one method of establishing whether or not menstruation has begun. But an actual blood stain in the area where blood stains would come from menstruation, and we'll talk about that later on in the Masechet, that is an even more telling sign that menstruation has begun. As such, the level of doubt that the rabbis were entertaining diminishes, and they say, okay, if there's actually that level of a sign, then we are more comfortable retroactively including the man in the window of retroactive impurity, and so that then does get applied to him. So, as always, the rabbis are dealing with what they can try to render in cases where information is imperfect.
So, Rabbi,
okay. Yeah.
Does the blood stains on the clothes or bed sheets take the place of the cloth, essentially, or rag?
Yes, it is considered a stronger indication, if you will. Because in order for there to be that, remember the testing cloths are really an internal level of examination, whereas something that has come out to leave a stain is going to be a much more, a much stronger flow at that point.
But I figured that you'd have to actually see the stains before you went to bed that night, right?
I'm not sure of the timeline that you're considering. What do you mean?
I just thought, my understanding when I read this is that the stains would have to take place right away, as like it would as if you checked yourself.
No, this would be like, so, for example, husband and wife, they have intercourse the next morning. He is out, feeding the chickens, and she is taking care of the rabbits. And actually, they wouldn't have had rabbits because there'd be no purpose to have rabbits on a Jewish farm. They really don't do much for us. She's taking care of the lambs, and she looks down and notices suddenly that there is a stain on her garments, indicative of the beginning of menstruation. That type of situation would then retroactively put her into the 24-hour impurity window. And because the nature of the discovery was the stain, he would also be caught up in that and also be considered ritually impure.
So there's no time frame in when you have to notice the stains on the garment?
24 hours. Okay. Now, we are talking about presumptions. Let's talk about a different presumption. All women are in the presumption of being pure for their husband. Okay. Generally speaking, a man should assume that if his wife was in a state of menstruation, that she would tell him. And that if she has not told him, then he should believe that they are ritually pure. That you don't start thinking, my wife is probably ritually impure, I better check. You start by thinking, if my wife were ritually impure, she would tell me, so she hasn't, so she must be ritually pure. Now, it might seem like that's a small thing, but it's a fairly big deal, because it would be very easy, and indeed some other communities around the world and even some sects within Judaism have tended to go towards a direction of assuming that because menstruation is a common thing, and because women are, quote, untrustworthy, that we should assume that they are ritually impure until we have a confirmation that they are not. But that is not the direction that Judaism, and especially Rabbinic Judaism, took. Rabbinic Judaism said, look, women are capable of understanding their own body. In fact, they're better at it than we are because they're the ones who live in it. And that means that we will trust them to inform the husband of any ritual impurity or of any signs that might need interpretation or discussion with the rabbi or teacher to, if there's a question mark. But this was left up to them. And indeed, throughout history, the rabbis who were men until very recently would teach the rules of Niddah and the rules of mikveh that we talked about in the previous Masechet. And they would ensure that women and men alike would know the rules and how it would be carried out. But much of it was carried out by the women on their own, meaning, a woman who was living on the farm would not go in to see the rabbi every single month to double check that the signs of menstruation were indeed the signs of menstruation. Once she knew what to look for, she was relied upon to make that determination for herself. Likewise, when it was time to go to the mikveh, assuming that she was living far from a man-built mikveh, she would use the river, the lake, the ocean at her discretion when it was the appropriate time. And her immersion was considered to be appropriate and kosher, and the intimacy with her husband afterwards was considered fine. There was a great deal of trust that was put in the hands of the woman, and also trust put into the hands of the man. Indeed, in other parts of the Talmud, they will often use the fact that we allow men and women who are married and used to being intimate together to cohabit with certain restrictions during the time when doing so, during the time which intercourse would lead to kare. We trust them to behave themselves and not engage. And if they do accidentally, we have means of rectifying that. Yes, Sarah.
Hey, how come the man-made mikvah works today but not back then?
No, the man-made mikvah worked back then. It's just not everybody was always able to have their own mikvah.
All right, because I thought I remember from mikvah that the man-made mikvah didn't purify an unclean woman. Am I wrong?
No, it worked. It worked for this. There were certain categories where the man-made mikvah would be of dubious use. For example, the needing water for a red heifer for hukat. But in general, the man-made mikvah would do everything that you would assume a mikvah would do for the average life. There were only a very, very few cases where it would be a problem. But historically, if you lived in the town, a mikvah was always going to be available. If you lived outside the town, or if you were traveling, very often an actual ready-made mikvah was not an option. And that didn't mean that people just stayed in ritual impurity until they found a man-made mikvah. It would mean they would use the mikvaot of the world, the rivers, the lakes, the ocean, as needed. Okay, so the general presumption, the woman is pure unless she says otherwise. However, for those who return from a journey, well, you might be thinking their wives are in the presumption of being pure. Okay, so again, even though he's now coming back and he hasn't been around, so, maybe he wasn't there to see the signs, maybe he wouldn't have noticed, even still, she would be considered ritually pure. Doubly so, you might have imagined that while he's away on a journey, she wouldn't be eager, quick, or diligent about immersing herself in the mikveh at the first opportunity, because after all, what's the rush? Because he's not home, so why do I need to go to the mikvah? It's not like I have a partner right now, so I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it, later. And that's not the presumption. The presumption is that she has, unless she says otherwise, taken note of her status, taken all proper steps to render herself ritually pure, and that she is ritually pure unless she gives other information. Beit Shammai says a woman needs 2 testing rags for every time she has intercourse, or she must have relations in the light of a lamp. Okay, you have to understand, this is talking about having sex more than one time in a night. And I know that sounds, how could they possibly do something like that? What did is this Playboy? No, that was not considered a bizarre or deviant behavior. However, it does have a certain practical question, which is, if we're having multiple times of intercourse, do we need new rags to test each time that we have intercourse? And Beit Shammai's answer to that is, yep, you need to have 2 for every time, or you have to have relations in the light of a lamp, meaning that you can check it in the light of the lamp each time. Beit Hillel says 2 testing rags suffice her for the whole night, meaning that you can check in the morning, and if it was signs of blood, then yes, there was the accidental beginning of Niddah, and now we know that she is in that state, and that's what we are left with. Okay, 2-5, yeah, doing good on time, I think. The sages spoke of a woman through a metaphor, and this metaphor is confusing, as Dr. Culp explains, or attempts to explain, but it's trying to describe the different sections within the woman's body, because there are differences of different types of blood. Like we've talked about since chapter 1, it is the blood from the womb that is the blood of Niddah. Blood from other sources of the woman's body in non-Niddah times do not have that same ritual impurity. So what is the metaphor? A chamber, a vestibule, meaning the entryway, and an upper chamber or attic. So what does this mean? Well, as Dr. Culp explains in the way that Rambam explains it, the chamber seems to be what's also called the makor. The source is the womb, is the uterus itself, whereas the vestibule, the entryway, is the vagina. Now, I've also heard it commentated as being the cervix, the entryway to the womb, but either will work for our discussion tonight. And then the upper chamber, well, the upper chambers are generally referred to as being the ovaries, and the fallopian tubes that bring we know that bring the egg down into the womb. So with that in mind, the blood of the chamber of the womb is unclean. That is the heart of Niddah, of ritual uncleanliness from this time. If blood is found in the vestibule, in the opening in the vagina or the cervix, and there arises a doubt about its character, and we'll see that there are many different ways to discern the type of blood, it is deemed unclean because it is presumed to have come from the source. So you might think, excuse me, here is blood in the vaginal area. Is this blood from the actual uterus, or is it from a wound? Was it somehow found its way in there in some other manner? If there is doubt about where that is from, then we have to assume that it is from the chamber, from the source, from the womb, and as such, we will treat it as being uterine blood and have all the rules of Niddah that we've talked about so far. So that, I know that metaphor is not really helpful because it's, we have a pretty good understanding of modern biology that I hope that those that are participating in the study paid attention during health class and can remember the basic anatomy. It is, however, gratifying that the rabbis were at least able to pay attention to the biology, most likely in animal husbandry, that allowed them to recognize that mammals have this rough structure, even if not all mammalian structures are parallel in humans. There's enough here that they were able to figure out something like this, lower, middle, and upper chamber system. And now that we are clear that the blood that we are concerned with has to be the uterine blood, well, we have to distinguish this from other types of, emissions. Like I said at the beginning tonight, the rabbis are fairly straightforward when discussing the fact that the human body emits all sorts of things, that the human body is not some marble statue. The human body is a living, breathing, and oozing organ that will come with all sorts of shades, colors, and textures of how it does its job. And it will often have errors in its job. One of the defining features of being a human being is being a material creature, and that means we break. We don't always work right. And strange and unusual things can happen to us, and we need to know how to discern between what is an actual emission that is triggering the treatment of Niddah and what is not. And again, just remember that this is a very important concept, that the rabbis are not just saying, if you see anything and you think it might be blood, just treat it like blood. The rabbis are saying, no, look at it, examine it. There is impure blood, meaning the blood that comes from the uterus, and you can tell what it looks like by its color. And this is going to lead us into that discussion. 5 kinds of blood in a woman are unclean: red, black, like bright crocus, like earthy water, or like diluted wine. And we're going to talk about all of those in more detail. Beit Shammai says, also like fenugreek, water, or the juice of roasted meat. But Beit Hillel declares these clean. So this seems to be some sort of very, very light reddish color, very watery. One that is yellow, Akavia ben Mahalalel declares unclean, and the sages declare clean. So this was a dispute about yellow, a very interesting discussion in Dr. Culp's commentary about yellow and green being borderline colors in the way that ancient colors were described. It's a fascinating field of linguistics of how colors originate in languages and which order in which they originate. But suffice to say, yellow or green, this is not considered to actually be blood, and therefore it is not something that would render ritually impure. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, on a side issue, I noticed Akavia doesn't have a title. Who is he?
I do not recognize him off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look into his source.
I noticed they don't use the word rabbi or state who he is by any means whatsoever.
That does happen sometimes for certain people that are on the earlier side of the rabbinic tradition. Oh. Like, for example, Hillel and Shammai also do not receive titles. Right. As odd as it is not to think of Rabbi Hillel. It's just not the way he's referred to.
And he's technically never did have the title rabbi, right?
Not in the official listing within rabbinic literature, but he had the job of being a rabbi, even if he didn't have that particular title. So he fills that role, but he didn't get the plaque. Rabbi Meir said, even if it does not convey uncleanness as a bloodstain, it conveys uncleanness as a liquid. So we will eventually learn that during Niddah, certain other liquids that are emitted by the woman will also transmit ritual impurity. And Rabbi Meir says these other liquids that are coming out, even if they are not unclean as a bloodstain, do count as being unclean as a liquid. Rabbi Yossi says it does neither the one nor the other, meaning that it doesn't count. If it doesn't count, it's not blood, and it's not one of the other official liquids that render impure. So therefore, it is neutral in its status. All right, and let's get into our color descriptions before we run out of time. What is considered red? Like red of a wound. Now, notice, first of all, the rabbis are doing an excellent job of trying to capture this in writing, but it's pointing to real world examples. You can't just say it's red because there are a million shades of red, but you can say, well, look at the red of a freshly cut wound. That's the red I'm talking about. Black, well, what do you mean black? Like ink sediment, meaning at the bottom of the ink pot. Darker than this is impure. If it's that dark or darker, then it's definitely impure. Lighter than this is pure, meaning that it's a very light shade of black, moving towards the gray spectrum. That would not be considered to be uterine blood. Like bright crocus, which is a type of flower, like the clearest shade in it. I'm not a big enough flower buff to know exactly what that looks like, but those of you who are better in botany will have something in mind. Like earthy water, well, from Beit Kerem Valley, when water floats over it. So if you take this sort of reddish earth and then you put water in it, you'll get a certain watery, ruddy color. That would also be considered uterine. And like diluted wine, well, how diluted is diluted? 2 parts water, 1 part wine, from wine of the Sharon. So with a benchmark type wine and a benchmark of how to mix it, that gives you an idea. It would be a relatively darkish color. It would not be translucent. It would have some actual depth to the color. And when you study this in more detail, which we will not be doing because it's something that takes a lot more individual tutoring, you actually will study the different shades. And there are sample cards that are used to try and train somebody to identify one type from another. So this is an important training step for being able to answer questions about this sort of issue. And with that, we have finished chapter 2 all in one night, but I don't think we're going to start chapter 3. We almost made it. Like I mentioned at the beginning, chapter 3 is going to deal with miscarriages. If that's a sensitive topic, please prepare yourself for it. But it is an important discussion and a strong reminder that miscarriages are a natural part of life. It is something that can be deeply emotionally painful, but it is not something for which a person should be ashamed or that a person should hide. It is very, very common, and as such, the rabbis need to discuss it in order to properly instruct the families that they attend to how to proceed. But we will get into that in much more detail with next week's study. It's good to be back, and let's keep pressing forward. Good night, everyone.